Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Hello, you homeschoolers out there, and welcome back to Homeschool Together. Thank you for joining us. If you have a chance, down below are all the buttons and links and everything that you may need to know, especially hopping on that Facebook group if you're new to homeschooling or you just discovered this homeschooling podcast, humble podcast of ours through your podcast feed or YouTube. We have a nice Facebook group out there, and then a lot of wonderful people posting stuff and answering questions, so feel free to hop over there and see if you can find some information. So today we're going to be talking about part two of homeschooling as a family, doing essentially your big curriculums. You know, how do you manage multiple children? How do you manage all this type of stuff? Last week we talked about kind of the pros and cons of kind of combining curriculums and bringing children together along the way, because we all, unfortunately, all of our children can't be all third graders and then all of a sudden all fourth graders.
Yeah, you who have singlets out there, that's kind of nice because you can just focus on one thing.
When you have one, you have none. That's my rule.
That's not true.
that's my rule. Once you have two, that rule immediately appears out of nowhere. It's like it just kind of like comes out of the bushes.
Right. Yeah, you feel like the people that only have one, you're like, wow.
So today we're going to be talking about some strategies. We kind of like teased some strategies from last week about what to do. But Ariel, why would people want to bring their kids together and homeschool them as a unit?
Yeah. So last week we talked about all the benefits of, learning together as a family and all the things that you get. So if you haven't listened to part one, go back and get all the valuable insight. And, there's some cons with it as well. But definitely go back and listen to that one. On the con side is like, how do you make the adaptation? It's not going to be super easy, right? Because every curriculum is sold for a specific, maybe a short age range or a specific grade, quote unquote, because we homeschoolers don't always use grades the way other people use grades. But so, you've got a curriculum that's made for, let's say, third grade, and you have a kindergartner and you have fifth grader and a third grader. And like, how do you make this all work for everybody? And I think that can be one of the biggest challenges to combining. So we just wanted to talk about like the common challenge with that is you have to balance meeting everybody's needs. You have a more advanced learner who needs things to keep them stimulated and challenged appropriately at their level. You have a younger student who may not understand these concepts, who could get overwhelmed or easily bored because they don't understand the concepts. And if they don't understand, then kind of what's the point of teaching everyone together? There's also a lot of additional work that we have to manage just prepping for this to meet everybody's needs. So that whole goal is to keep everyone, yourself included, engaged and motivated, which can be a real challenge when you're trying to all teach together based off of one set curriculum. So
jumping into kind of the initial strategies that you may need to apply, and you don't have to do every one of these, but they may have they may apply to different families and different needs and whatnot. First thing would be is tiering your assignments. So if you have some type of activity that you need to do, that you somehow structure it so that a little bit more complexity is given to the older student, a little bit lower complexity is given to the younger student, and then you can kind of encompass the same theme or topic. That requires a little, a subtlety there and a little bit of work. But I believe that's probably the first thing that most people would do is say, okay, what are we teaching in this moment, and how can I kind of level it up a little bit and structure it up?
Right. When we were doing ancient civilizations last year, our daughter was studying, Egypt, for example, just as an example, culture, and she was really learning about it. She was doing some writing and things. We had coloring pages and art projects for our younger daughter, so she was listening and she was taking in some of the information, but she had something to do that was kind of on her own level. So I think that's the first thing is taking a look at what you've got, and making sure that you can make a correct adaptation. Now, if we'd had an older learner, let's say because we had a pre-K, we had a second grader, let's say we had a fifth grader as well, I might assign that older child a chapter book that they would read in their extra time, or maybe they would write some sort of a small report.
Yeah.
So
some paragraph writing activity, something that you have to challenge them at their level. Yeah.
Exactly. So it might not be, and maybe we get some books that are more in depth about ancient Egypt. Maybe they even do like an oral report about what they have learned. Those are just some different ideas. So you kind of take the topic that you're learning and you think about where everybody's at and try to give them something that they can do. This is difficult because let's say you have 3 kids, you may have 3 times the work, or maybe hopefully one of your students can do exactly what the curriculum's written, and the other ones you make adaptations. So maybe it's only twice the amount of work. But
I find personally when I get into the situation, having 3 or 4 options typically that you tend to be looking for, like you said, giving them a chapter book is a great idea. Writing sentences, collecting data, things like that. Could be great for an older student. So if you have kind of instead of thinking of it as a unique thing every single time, have kind of like a little war chest of, topics and things that you need to work on with your learner, especially the areas of struggle. I always like to bring in a little bit of those activities. Like, for example, our oldest, handwriting and writing sentences. That's kind of the new thing for her. And so I'm trying to take any opportunity that's available in our around the world journey or trekking the globe to have her write a little bit more, write some sentences and whatnot, and give her that different activity. So structure an activity around maybe an area of new interest or challenge that they may need, while then, doing the regular curriculum with the older one. So don't try to just say, okay, I'm always going to do the same thing. Here's an older book for you, know, that type of thing. Try to have a couple ideas available, kind of classes of activities, so that you can dip into and maybe rotate as you're doing this tiered activity.
Yeah, and ChatGPT is a great way to help you out, or Google's Gemini now.
Gemini,
it used to be Bard, but now Gemini. If you want to ask some questions about, hey, I'm studying this topic, and these are the ages of my kids, give me some ideas. One of the things that works out really well, I like, is things that have natural tiering, like art, for example. So your youngest can do the most basic, easiest art. You can have your older student doing something much more complex. So I like, there's certain things like art or reading independently, and then of course you can tier it. But tiering does take more work because you are coming up with completely separate activities.
I think going into the next one here is a good example of one of the strategies you can take, especially with an older learner, but I think you can combine it as well.
You definitely can.
But it's project-based learning. So assigning a general project and giving roles within that project to your children. So if you have 2 kids, obviously a good example of that would be like, you're building a volcano or something like that. And then you give a lot of the, maybe the structure work to the older student and maybe the painting work to the younger student or something like that.
The older student, maybe the younger student would come up with the observations about what's happening when the volcano erupts. The older student is writing about the chemicals and the actual reaction. I especially like it for science. I think it's great because when we teach our younger students to observe, and our older students can document. So I think that's really great. If you can come up with a project where everyone has a role, I love the concept of a family garden. We have some friends that have a really nice garden, and they love to do that. And their kids are all different ages, of course. I think they've got like 10 to 17 is their range, and they all work in this garden together. And I think that's great, right? Because we can get little ones who are helping out with the weeding and the digging the planting holes, and older ones who are learning about photosynthesis or
analyzing diseases they may see and trying to look that up. And you can really
study bugs. I mean, there's lots of things you can do.
You can really scale that complexity. Now, kind of going along with that, with this kind of project-based learning where everybody's working together, this idea of kind of like a buddy system where you are having older learners teaching younger learners, or having younger learners run activities where older learners are engaged, where this kind of like they're working together,
right?
And engagement in that kind of that collaborative sense.
One of the things that I like, we talked about in last week's episode about the benefits of having older learners help younger learners and reteach that information. But I like the idea too of having our older learners do some lesson planning. So one of the things that we've done in our Girl Scout troop, because we have a multi-age homeschool troop, sometimes our older, middle school and early high school students or scouts will go ahead and actually make badge work for the youngers. This is really great because not only are they going to participate in the activity with the younger students, but they had to do all of the planning for it. So a little bit of planning offload, which I think is kind of nice. Obviously, you have to make sure that your older student is at a level that they could, you're having them plan appropriately, and that they understand the information well enough to plan. So it's not, completely perfect, but I love the idea of outsourcing a little bit of our planning of something to do with the younger by having the older ones. So an idea, obviously, if they're in middle school or high school, you could have them try to actually look up and plan the assignment. But let's say that they're younger than that. Let's say you have an upper elementary school as your older student. You could say, I want you to plan an imaginative theater activity where you're going to act out this time period in history, and you can set it up however you want. Yeah. And that's something that maybe they don't have to actually read and do that level of research, but they can set up, they can get the costumes out for the younger kids. They can help them with props and making things. I mean, so it can be at the appropriate level, but I love the idea of kind of buddy system work.
Yeah, tying that back, like kind of what you said there with the role playing, tying that back into the literature that you're doing as well, and exploring characters and theme and setting and narrative, having them kind of like, or do what if scenarios, things like that. That's a great way to go as well.
Even having your older students talk with your youngers about what's going on in the book. Hey, what do you think's going to happen in the next chapter?
Exactly.
Wow.
I've been doing a lot more of that with our reading activity, and not just writing it, but also asking like, what do you think is going to happen in the story? Really engaging the text and asking the student to kind of do some predictive work where they are thinking about what we have read or they have read, and then trying to anticipate what is going to happen based on their prior knowledge and background knowledge. I think it's been something that I've been putting in here in the last few weeks. It's been really kind of a cool little wrinkle that I've been doing with like the handwriting, a lot of the literature work, and also kind of like, vocabulary and things of that nature, being able to kind of connect between, what they're reading, what they're thinking, and what they're seeing and writing, kind of getting that synergy going together, doing that in a buddy system where maybe the older student is then writing sentences and the younger one is maybe reading those sentences, things of that nature. You can really have a real nice kind of back and forth kind of seesaw with both students where they're kind of working together to do a common task, and piggybacking on some of the other strategies that we'd already talked about with collaborative work and that type of thing.
I love having the idea too of having an older student and younger student like write a book together.
Oh, yeah.
Where the younger student is doing the art and the older student is doing all of the writing.
Like Captain Underpants, Harold and George.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, there's some cool things that you could do. I mean, maybe the younger student helps come up with ideas and they do these parts of it. I mean, anything we do kind of out in the world as a job is part of a team. So I think teaching our kids that they can work either, just with one sibling as a partnership or even with a couple of siblings. So maybe this kind of leans into your project-based learning too, but maybe that helping those older students can help you come up with those projects.
Well, and I think these type of activities, where you're doing this buddy system, the project-based learning kind of group collaborative working, I think is a great way for you to do something different than like just the explicit teaching that we always do. Like, right. I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, it's just kind of getting stuck in a rut where I'm just like, here's the information. Here's the information. Here's the information. Yeah. And sometimes we lose that connection where we want the students to engage as well and do their own type of thinking. And sometimes I find it maybe coming out of like the holiday season where I'm doing a lot more like, okay, here, we just get it done. Let's do some work. And then because we're really, really busy, when we come out of that, when I start asking them to do their own thinking or asking them questions, I get the shoulder shrug. I don't know. right. And
our 9-year-old's big on the shrug right now.
Oh my gosh. It's so hilarious. And I even call it out ahead of time and then she does it. But getting them to engage in the material, I think is a real important thing that we need to do. And I think sometimes that gets lost when we're like doing our workbooks. We just had the podcast on workbooks. When we're doing kind of this direct instruction, I think we can get kind of lost in that, and doing these collaborative efforts, I think is a good way to pull yourself out of that and doing something a little bit different, a little bit fresh, and maybe can hit that information from a different angle, and allowing the students to engage with it, I think can get a little bit more retention on knowledge.
Yeah.
So being able to do those type of, different thing here, it requires us to have a little bit of flexibility in our schedule, and being flexible in not only just how we teach our students, tiering things, grouping them, but also being flexible in, when we do certain things. Like there's a structure and a flow to our day.
You could absolutely say like, okay, our mornings are just for group work, and we're going to do all of our common subjects together. And then the afternoons, we're going to do all of our individual subjects. You could also rotate your days. And so, okay, hey, science is always on Fridays. That's the day we do everything together. Maybe you're not doing, you may only be doing your social studies and science together, and the rest of everything's individual. So you might just have a couple of days a week where you're doing those. So, either making some consistency about like, okay, well, this is group time and this is individual time, or this is a whole group day where we study a subject and maybe we do a field trip or whatever. This is a day we do everything together. But keep it flexible if you're going to teach everyone together, because there's definitely, if you haven't done this in the past, you might have to adjust the way that your schedule worked before so you can find time for everyone to do these pieces together. And I think it helps too for kids to know when it's a together time versus an individual time. Otherwise, what we tend to get, we've done this a few times, is one of the kids will start zoning out like, oh, this isn't my time, right? Because they're used to kind of working near each other, but working on different things. And so we have to kind of go, okay, everybody, it is now time to be focused and working on the same thing together. And they're like, huh? So
that's the setting expectations thing.
Right.
Like communicating, setting expectations, I think is kind of what you're saying there. And I use this technique all the time, this kind of flexible scheduling, doing one child, working with one child here, having another child do something that's more independent, or, for example, front loading the morning with my youngest because she tends to get up earlier and she wants to move and do things quicker. I can get a lot of throughput there when she's really, fresh and up and awake and just fed. Takes my older one a little bit slower, and so I can give my youngest one activities like to go play with kinetic sand, do some artwork, do something over here, and then I can do math and reading, with my student, my older one here. And then when we come back together after that, we can do our trekking the world stuff and whatnot, and then I can do some workbooks, sprinkled throughout the day, that type of thing. So thinking about your flexibility and in the flow of your day, and that's something that it takes a long time to kind of get used to. And,
yeah, it's
and
true.
then also it's always changing.
Right. Like we're having a snow day today. So our whole schedule is
2 days in a row.
Yeah. It's like,
I get all the homeschool done.
Right. It's kind of crazy. So being adaptable.
No rest for the weary, guys. No. Yeah. School day for the other kids is a homeschool day for us.
The other thing that you have to do really, I think if you're going to combine and learn as a family, I don't know that there's a way to do it without adding on your own resources. This is something that, if you're doing something like a Waldock Way or something where they've given you tons and tons of resources, then great, you have something there. But most of the time, if a curriculum is based in an age range or a grade, it's going to be limited in resources. One of the curriculums too that is grade specific but does have a lot of resources would be Blossom and Root, because she has different things for like hands-on kids versus science kids,
like book learners, art families, things of that nature.
Right. So she's got a lot of things, and I think a lot of those make for good adaptations, older and younger, which is great. So Blossom and Root especially if you're a science family, I think that's a great one to look into. But adding your own resources is something that you're going to need to do, whether it's books or media, whether it's offering your older student who, may be able to watch older movies, something that, they can watch with mom and dad or whatever.
Or you getting different Yodo cards for different books that, audio reads for the week that the kids can listen to. One for the younger one for the older one.
Right. Yeah. We love using Libby as well from our library. And so, right. I don't think that this is something that you can really do without putting in not just your own planning, but getting your own extra resources. There's going to be some amount of that.
Yeah.
Some things kind of are universal and we could read them with any age and they work well. But I think you're going to have to do a certain amount of digging. So find good resource, partners that you can find things from.
Do you find when you're doing that work at the beginning, you tend to go to the same kind of things? Like we were talking earlier about the tiered approach, when you kind of tier things to have kind of like a little like utility belt of options and activities. Right. when you're trying to do these bolt-on add-ons, do you tend to just go to the library and then like pick up common books? Or are you looking for the same type of thing? Or we have a lot of books in this house, so we can pick from our own shelves.
We can pick from our own shelves. I tend to, if it's history, I love going to Emily Cook's history book by book site because it gives a great listing of books for different ages, for different history topics. So that's a really great one. We have some favorite YouTube channels that we like to go to. Yeah, I mean, and sometimes something like a Blossom and Root that gives you multiple ideas is great, and one of those won't be exactly what I need for my younger learner or whatever. So, but I'll spur off of that, and then I'll end up going to somewhere like Pinterest too, especially if I'm looking for art projects, and try to find something that I think that would be accessible to, whichever student that is. So there are a few places that I tend to go to. I also tend to go and look up if anybody has made any unit studies on that topic, because if they have, that's a whole mess of resources, right? Like when we're studying Egypt, for example, that one was, of course, pretty easy. There's tons of resources out there. Lots of blogs and stuff have reported on unit studies that they have just made and done themselves, and there's all kinds of resources there. And if you look at a few of the different blogs, then you're going to end up finding students of varying ages, and you get kind of a plethora of resources. So find some of your favorite sites to get add-on resources. And if you haven't checked out History Book by Book, definitely do that. But that's where I typically go. That's where I start anyway.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about practical tips for kind of very specific scenarios when we have, obviously starting off with the early learners, those young learners. What are we thinking about when we're thinking about, scaling activities, scaling learning, scaling curriculum for them? We may have a curriculum that we're a little bit ahead and we have to scale down. I think that's a little bit more of a challenge. That activity, like we've talked about this in the past. If like, say you have a kindergartner and a second grader, it's harder to take a second grade curriculum and scale it down to kindergarten. You're probably better off going from kindergarten up to second grade because it's easier to add on. We always make the joke, it's easier to take clothes off in the summer than it is to put, it's better. No, it's easier to stay warm in the winter because you just keep layering on more clothes. Eventually you just get too hot and you can't take anything else off.
Exactly.
Right? And so I think going down, now I think if you have a first grader and a second grader, that might be a little bit easier. But if you're starting to think about like a 2 or 3 year gap, I think it's a little bit more of a challenge. And we've chosen to stay with the lower grade and scale up for our learner. And I think that's been fairly easy to do for us. Yeah.
We're going to do a podcast about the 4-year history cycle. And I have some thoughts about this, specifically if you want to use something like a Build Your Library Torchlight that's going to, go with the 4-year history cycle and kind of how you can work that. But in general, when we're talking about adapting for younger learners, we really want to remember that most really young learners are sensory based, right? They're going to be your kinesthetic learners,
visual learners,
right? It's not that they won't listen to books. When our daughter was our older one, when she was in kindergarten, she would listen to us read for hours. So it's not that, but they do tend to get the most out of things that they can touch and feel. Like think about the children's museums you have gone to, right? Everything is really hands-on. So when I'm looking for something
at that age group, they're still learning through sensory input and seeing things. Yeah.
And so that's why with our younger daughter now, who's in kinder, I'm always looking for things that she can touch. Like, can we mold something from air clay? Because if we can, that is totally on the, and you will find that you kind of tend to go back to the same types of things, but you can think outside the box. You could do puppets. You can do costume role play,
songs
different
and
kinds
music
of arts.
and things.
Songs are great. Yeah. You can, and when it comes to music, you could like make your own instruments with household things. So there's lots of great stuff that you can do. But remember when we're scaling younger, that you want to look for, tactile, hands-on things that they can do.
Absolutely. Now, with the older learners, you're starting to think about independence emerging.
Right.
I think kind of that, I don't want to say like exactly at this age, but maybe that 3rd grade, 4th grade, you're starting to think more, what can they do on their own? What can they do independently? At this age, they're starting to read on their own. They're starting to read for enjoyment, hopefully. And these are types of things we're starting to think, okay, they're doing their own thing. And it almost kind of comes with some of the behavioral changes as well. Like our daughter wants to have her own time. She wants to do her own thing. She's been getting into her spa class. So she wants to do her little spa routine and all these types of things. She wants to do things on their own. It kind of comes with the idea of independence. And we want to start thinking about activities that they can do on their own, maybe with minimal guidance where they come back and check back in, after the activity is done. I don't know with like kind of the 4th, 5th, 6th graders that I want to give them a multi-day project. I'm still thinking in my mind, still single day activities. But
well, we're not there yet, but I remember being in 5th and 6th grade and having to do book reports and dioramas and state reports and things that
may take a few days. Yeah.
That may take a few days. So you can come up with different ideas. You can make lap books or poster boards for older students that they can work on.
Travel journals, journaling, things like that.
Yeah, they can write their own stories. So there's lots of great things for older students. I think the thing that we need to be a little bit cautious about is it's very easy to say, oh, older learner, I'm going to give you all these independent things.
A lot of
as
times
your way to level up.
Well, they need to be guided a little bit. They need to
But they also need to be included.
Yeah.
I think that this is a danger we can get into.
That's a good point.
If we
like
had
this.
a student who, let's say right now we had a student who is in 6th or 7th grade in middle school, I would be thinking about assigning that student like, oh, read this book outside, do this report on it, do these other things. And I'm not saying that stuff's not valuable and you shouldn't do that, but I think it could come at the expense of that learner being included in some of the fun things, right? I mean, as a community theater nerd, I would say things like doing role playing and having a part. Don't think your student's too old for that, or at least check with them and see if they want to be included, because I don't want to say like, oh, we're just going to give you a whole bunch of independent study stuff and we're learning it all as a family. It's like, well, but maybe they're not really included, or maybe when it comes to art, they would be doing some sort of art, but they would be doing it in the original style of the people that you're studying, or with some of the original materials. Maybe they make their own paints or something. I don't know. I'm just saying that I worry a little bit. It's very easy to say, oh, give them a book and have them write some stuff, have them write a report or have them do whatever.
Don't forget about the connection.
Yeah, the connection is super key, because it's one of the big pros of learning together as a family, that you can connect and everyone can talk about the same subjects and learn together. So you just have to be a little careful not to exclude our older learners too much by giving them too much independent stuff.
I think it's a great, don't let independence allow you to forget them, that they're there. Yeah, I think there could be that pull to like, okay, you're an independent learner, you can do what you want. But even at that age, and even all the way through high school and even into college, they're having dialogues with other classmates, with their teachers asking them questions, they're answering questions. We don't want to lose that in the chase for independence, right? Like we want to be part of that process. We want to be there to evaluate and assess what they're doing and how they're doing. We may not spend all our time with them like we used to, but still having that connection, not like thread based, but actually like having legitimate connection. I think that's a great point. I like that. So we have younger learners, we have older learners. Then let's talk about kind of larger families.
Yeah, if you've got a larger family, then you start getting into some of the like classroom techniques, right? You can do, because you have more students, maybe you might want to do something like rotating stations, for example, where you have different activities going on, or
that's the number one technique in my master's program. When I watch the videos when they're showing teachers doing some type of activity, so they bring cameras into the classroom, and I'm watching these videos of these teachers doing things. The most hilarious one was the 25-year-old young man who wanted to teach 5th grade but was assigned the kindergarten classroom. I've never seen a man with more dead eyes in his life, just in there going, I have 35 5th and 5 and 6-year-olds, and he's just like melting in front of the camera. But they tend to, not just that class, but almost all the classes I've seen in the videos, they have rotating stations. Typically, 4 to 5 kids per station. They tend to be more like 4 to 5. I see sometimes 6, but they will give them an activity that they kind of go around. So the idea of rotating stations is like, I think that's like task number one when it comes to classroom management.
Right. If you have a large family, I think that's a great thing to do. You probably already do that now.
Yeah.
And a station they rotate through might be the station where they do some of their individual learning too. So I think that's a nice way to go. Obviously, if you're a large family parent, you know all about managing a large group and how to keep them moving. But you can think about it in terms of all studying something together by putting different activities for the same subject. I've heard of lots of large families who do rotation, but it's all different subjects. So it's like, okay, while I'm doing math with these two younger ones, the older ones are doing their science, and these other ones are doing their online history, and these ones are doing, and they're all doing different things. But to think about it in terms of stations that are all about the same subject is just something to food for thought. And I think another idea, if you're going to do stations, or even if you want ideas for hands-on activities, if you can look up some of the museums that have really great children's exhibits, you might be able to find out what types of activities they have there for kids to do, because we've been to some that were just terrific, and you could definitely replicate some of that at home. Like there was one that we went to where they were all, they were talking about archaeology in this area of Ireland we were at, and the kids got to like put on little hard hats or whatever.
Swords
and they got to, well, no, this was where they got to actually dig, right?
Oh, this was the digging one.
It was a digging thing. Yeah. So I was like, you could easily do something at home like that, depending on how you're going to do the dig and whatever, but just might give you some ideas to set up stations, as long as it's not too much work. Definitely you can keep everybody occupied in groups of 2 or even 3 doing their different activities.
One thing I've noticed about doing the rotations, even though I have a rotation of 2, I do notice that some children, I'm speaking to you, older one, in the future when you're listening to this, wondering what mommy and daddy did on the podcast for all those years. I have to do those things. She has to be in a different room, or her sister has to be in a different room, because she can get very easily distracted.
That's true.
So if you're thinking about rotations, just rotating the kitchen table is really, really difficult and challenging. If you have a student who struggles to stay on task when you're working with them and doing things, if there are distractions, noises, sounds, music, whatever, I've even gone as far as getting kind of noise canceling headphones to allow her to have kind of that quiet space so she can focus. Because I don't think it's because she doesn't like what she's doing. It's just that, she could be doing her math, addition, multiplication work that she might be doing, or she could see her sister playing with kinetic sand. And that's way more interesting than this stuff. And so I've had to really employ strategic areas. Like it goes even so far as, like the other day I was working some basketball stuff when her younger sister was at basketball practice. I am in a basketball gym and we're working on moves. Like I'm building her bag of moves that she can use. And the girl could not focus on me because everybody was behind me. And I was like, oh, okay. So we swapped so that she's looking at the wall in the corner, and man, I had her focus. So just knowing those little things and not getting frustrated when that happens, just know, okay, I got to remember she's got to be turned away and she needs her headphones right now, because this activity is going to be a little bit louder and she's going to get distracted, right? Setting expectations and time sometimes helps as well, keeps her focused. Oh, I gotta get this done. Just knowing that when you're working the multiple groups and the larger families, that you may need to make accommodations for different learners who have different, styles. My youngest could care less if there was something on. She will do her work because she's always lived in the chaos and the noise. The oldest had a lot of quiet time, and so for her, any distraction, the eyes start moving. It's like, oh, there's a squirrel. There's a squirrel. There's a squirrel.
Yeah,
so I have to do a little bit different. Adapting what I do even in that environment. So if you have a larger family, you may have to think about a little bit more creativity in your rotations if you do something like that.
Yeah. So I hope this was helpful. Just some ideas for adapting. It's, you can always, of course, make your own curriculum, and then you're going to use a lot of these same techniques to do that. But if you're definitely trying to take something and start with that as a base level, then hopefully this gives you some ideas. And we're going to keep talking next week in our series about family learning. We're going to talk about you, us.
Me?
The adults, and how we can join family learning. Because that's, for me, selfishly, this has been a big thing that I have really enjoyed in this last year.
It's Science Week. We're learning about robots. Got to watch Terminator. Simple things.
Simple. It's the little things.
It's the little things. Anyway, we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook, and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram.
We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time,
Happy homeschooling!